Welcome. It has just gone 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Wednesday, the 7th of June, and you are watching episode 89 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing an insight into issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, Australians for Unity, the Voice No campaign, is my guest, Gary Johns. Gary was a minister in the Keating government and has, over time, drifted away from the ALP and has been critical of his old party. He has been a senior fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs and headed their non-government organisations unit. In 2009, he was appointed Associate Professor of Public Policy at the Australian Catholic University's Public Policy Institute and is an adjunct professor at University of Queensland's TC Burney School of Law. Gary is a columnist for the Australian newspaper and author of numerous papers and books, including Waking Up to Dreamtime, Aboriginal Self-Determination, and Recognise What. In 2017, he was appointed the Commissioner of the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission and resigned the position on the election of the Labor government in 2022. As a committee member of Recognise a Better Way, he has worked on the merger with Fair Australia to create a single major group, Australians for Unity, to lead the Voice No campaign. Welcome, Gary.
Thanks, Bill.
It's a pleasure to have you here. It is such an important topic, and it's certainly get a lot of airtime out there. It's in our face with the ABC fairly regularly, and there's no end of media adverts and that for the campaign. And I even noticed someone in the paper complaining about Woolworths having it over their radio system in the Woolworths chain. So we're certainly getting a dose of it.
Yeah, it's the Commonwealth government's spending a lot of money on the campaign, but so a lot of corporations and unfortunately, I might say a lot of charities, which I think is a very poor use of their funds. But happy to discuss any of these matters, Bill.
I'd like to really start off with the two different groups and their merger. You had Recognise a Better Way. That was your group. How did you sort of decide to work and create a single group?
Well, Recognise a Better Way concentrated on writing some big papers. So someone needed to do the work of explaining what the Voice was about, explaining treaty and truth-telling. There were three major papers, and the Fair Australia was really a campaigning organisation. So they're very good on the ground and lots of supporters who are prepared to work on, say, referendum day. So we thought at best we put the two groups together. Our front players are Jacinta and Warren Mundine. And there are other players such as myself who are more than happy to travel around Australia and speak to whomever to explain the madness of this referendum.
One of the big points about the referendum is the thrust of the advertising and the thrust of the government. It's got to be the cure-all for Indigenous problems. But if we have a look at what we've been doing with the Indigenous in the last, well, since Federation, say, and then especially in the last 20 or 30 years with the expenditure, and the formations of different groups. We originally had ASIC, and now we've got the Indigenous Agency in Canberra as well. And then with that, you've got streams and streams of other smaller players out there. So there's no no shortage of people who supposedly represents the position of the Indigenous people and speaking on their behalf to government. So it seems a bit strange that we need this without at least sort of having some sort of assessment of what we've been doing before this.
Quite right, Bill. Look, there's a long history to this. Up to 1967, which was the last referendum really on, well, the main one on Aboriginal matters, the whole tenor of it was that Aboriginal people wanted equality with the white man. That was the language at the time. And they got it. And 92% of Australians supported that. So what's happened since? Two things have happened. Most Aboriginal people, about 80%, have moved into the open society. They've physically moved in some instances, intermarried in many instances, got themselves educated, bring up families. That's all happened. But there's a group that went off to university and learned a particular ideology from the white man, quite frankly, that said, we want Aboriginal self-determination. And that means only Aborigines should run their own organisations, only Aborigines should talk to Aborigines. And that's okay, but if you're within a university, but that idea should never have escaped a university, I can tell you, because that's why a minority of Aboriginal people have been left out of this society. They're mainly sitting in remote areas and they're being tended to by Aboriginal groups, right? And it's sort of like you have permission to just be an Aboriginal. But that's not enough. It's not enough being Aboriginal. You've got to actually learn how to survive in this society. We're not hunters and gatherers anymore. We've now got to learn to survive in a modern society. So the last, I estimate about 20% of Aborigines are in big trouble because those graduates in the second, third generation after 1967 think it was a good idea to have those poor souls sitting out in North Australia, living supposedly their culture, which we know has been disastrous for them. And it's okay for, the PhDs and professors at Sydney University and the University of Queensland and Melbourne University to play the big man and the big woman, but they're actually hurting their own people in remotes. So, Bill, this next few months, we must stop putting that crazy idea that only Aborigines have solutions to Aboriginal problems. We've got to stop it by voting no at the referendum. And then next year, Recognise a Better Way is going to run a major conference, which we'll call something like The Truth, The Whole Truth, and Nothing But the Truth. And we will really tell the whole story of what's gone on in the last, since 1967.
I think the other thing with 1967, it's become a bit of a mythology that it granted Indigenous people, things everything from citizenship to the right to vote and that, when really it only ever actually provided that they're going to be counted in the census and then changed the law to repeal section 127 and also let the Commonwealth make laws on behalf of Indigenous people. So it wasn't the world beater that so many people think it was, So that's a bit of a problem. And there seems to be an ongoing shift along the way to sort of make a myth of Aboriginal culture as well in regards to elevate it to some status that maybe we should try to emulate sort of things somewhere along the line. I think that's becoming a bit of a problem as well.
Yes, look, there are a number of myths about 1967 and we probably don't have time to go through it, but very little change. It's just that the Commonwealth was able to take responsibility for Aboriginal affairs or for matters concerning Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and they have, and with great respect to all, it's because the Commonwealth has all the money. That's what happened, right? So the industry then just blossomed. Aboriginal people were counted in the census. Aboriginal people did have the vote, and that was not the question for 1967. The question was whether Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander would be excluded from the race clause, if you like. We should have taken the word race out in 67, but that didn't happen. Okay, so what's now happening is this reverence almost for culture. And I'm sick to death of public servants who are constantly recognising culture and elders without any idea what it is. They have no idea. And I even ask Aboriginal people what it means. They don't know. They just don't know. Mostly they've learned it from university lecturers. So those Australians who are closer to Aboriginal people, especially those living in the north, have a much greater understanding of what Aboriginal culture was, and to some extent still is, and some of it is very unhealthy. You know, the payback is very unhealthy. The belief in sorcery is very unhealthy. The intense humbugging is very unhealthy. So I've asked public servants, is that what they mean when they want to acknowledge culture? And they look at you blankly because they really don't know. They just don't know. So the thing about Northern Australians and people up in your region is that they do have a much stronger understanding of, if you like, what Aboriginal people are struggling with and the burden they have in their culture. And I'm going to give my book a plug here called The Burden of Culture, right? I'm addressing that issue that says it's not an easy journey that Aboriginal people have to undertake, but part of that journey is not only learn how to get into the wider society, but how to stop some of the things that they are brought up with. That I think is going to be the hard part for them.
The other big thing in between, it's been 50 years from the census in first count in 71 to the last count in 2021. So 50 years rolled by. The number of people identifying as Indigenous or Torres Strait Islander was about 115,000 in 71. It's now 842,000. In the equivalent time, Australia's population has gone up from about 12,500 to nearly 26 million, just over 100%. But the rise in people identifying as Indigenous has gone up more than 700% increase. While birth rate is generally higher with Indigenous slightly, it's nowhere near that rate. So is there going to be a continued problem with people self-identifying as we move through, especially
yes,
if the voice gets up?
There's no doubt that especially, well, starting in the 1970s, you're quite right, but especially after about 1990, people were actually encouraged to tick the box to say if they had any Aboriginal heritage, then they could tick the box. And any child of an Aboriginal and non-Torres Strait Islander Aboriginal coupling was also encouraged to tick the box. So there's no wonder that the numbers went up. But where do those people live? Coastal New South Wales, suburban Brisbane, Melbourne, really. So we're talking about different people altogether to those who live in remote areas. And that suits the Aboriginal elite, the leadership that say, wow, look at our numbers. But the rest of the country should know that they are not their numbers. A large proportion of those people live next door to us and are suburbanites. They have nothing to do with the last 20% who are yet to work out how this society works and how they make the transition.
The other thing is, you're talking about in the 90s, there's a big uptick. I'm pretty sure in Queensland that was encouraged, but the encouragement comes from the GST redistribution, because if you look at the way GST's broken up, Queensland gets nearly $1 billion more because of its Indigenous population in the GST grant. So it was incentivised for them to get that number up as much as possible to get that GST flowing through.
Yeah, quite right. And look, I think we've got to call this one out. We should not be spending money on Aboriginal programs. We should spend money only on need. That's all. And even Marcia Langton, you know, one of the great principles of the Aboriginal industry, has said recently that she thinks about 30% of Aboriginal people are doing okay. I'd say about 80%. About 80% are doing as well as anyone else. Not that they're all doing well, but about as well as anyone else. And Marcia also said we should only have programs according to need. Now, I've never heard Marcia say anything like that in the 40 years I've been listening to her. So, but she's right. There should be no programs in federal or state level based on descent. It should be based on need. If you're in trouble and you need help, then we've got a terrific welfare state, our medical system, education system, and we should help people, not because they're of Aboriginal descent, because they're in need. So look, I'd be, if I were a politician, I'd be saying something like no race-based programs by 2030. You know, we all have to have a target. Let's wipe this industry out, but make sure we look after those in need. That would prove the industry out. That would catch them out.
Well, I'll just put up a screen here. This is the National Indigenous Australians Agency, was established in 2019. The executive order gives a number of functions: lead and coordinate Commonwealth policy development, program design and implementation of service delivery for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, to provide advice to the Prime Minister and the Minister for Indigenous Australians on whole of government priorities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, to lead and coordinate the development and implementation of Australia's Closing the Gap targets in partnership with Indigenous Australians, to lead the Commonwealth in activities to promote reconciliation. Now, that's a fair sort of charter and a fair bit of scope to talk to the government. And on top of that, its job is also to liaise with states and territories and the thousands of NGOs that are providing services for the Indigenous people. And if you look between the public service of the states, the Commonwealth, then you've got this body, then you've got all the departments within the states, and then you've got these NGOs. You're nearly running probably as many as well, maybe there'll be one person, there'll be one Indigenous person for every 4 people who are employed in that program.
Yeah, the NIAA, which really came out of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. There's a lot of shuffling going on, but the point is, it's already a standing shadow government. It already has its hands over all of the elements of Commonwealth programs and monies that support Aboriginal people, and they liaise intimately with all of the Aboriginal organisations, the many that you mentioned, including a group called the Peaks, which is all the peaks of the Aboriginal bodies in health and education and welfare. So we actually don't need the voice. It's all there. It's been operating for many, many years. In fact, you could even say that the old ATSIC, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, might have been abolished, but it's still there. It's still operating. All of the Aboriginal leaders who want to change the Australian Constitution actually have a voice. We hear them every day. They're all sitting on committees of government. They're all being paid. This has all been done. I tell you what we do need, Bill. We need a different conversation. We need not to put those people in the Constitution. That would be just disastrous for us. We need, when this referendum is defeated, we need next year to have a whole new state of mind that says the purpose of Aboriginal policy is to integrate Aboriginal people. That is to give them a foot in the door. It is not to support self-determination, because that's been the dominant ideology for 30 years, and that's what's killing the last 20%, holding them out. And all of the Aboriginal leaders who are now telling you to vote yes are the architects of that policy. They have been in there every day, sitting at the table, designing the policies that are crueling the last 20%. And these are the people that want to change the way we govern Australia by having a voice in the Constitution. We're going to call them out, mate. That these are not people who are helping, they are harming.
The thing is, they need that 20% to be in dire straits to get the attention and say, look at this, this has all got to be improved. If the lot of that 20% was improved markedly, they'd have no purpose. And the other thing is, we've got a big budget for Indigenous programs, and it filters through so many departments, so many NGOs, and gee whiz, you just have to wonder how much of that $35 billion actually flows down and does some good.
Well, a lot of it flows down, to tell you the truth, but it's not doing much good. It's like any welfare money, it's there to support, but when it becomes a way of life intergenerationally, it then becomes an evil. It really does harm people. And, you know, Noel Pearson, when he was at his best, which was a good 20 years ago now, would warn us about the harm of welfare. He no longer talks about that. He's gone off, drifted off onto other things, unfortunately. But look, when people talk about closing the gap, and I'm sick of Prime Ministers doing an annual closing the gap report, they all think the gap is between Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people. It's not. The gap is between a small group of Aboriginal people and everyone else in Australia. So I'll give you the example. It's a shocking statistic, but about 20% of Aboriginal men have been to jail, a lesser proportion of women. If you take the 20% of men out of the census data that talks about income, education, employment, and so on, all the usual measures, you'll find that Aboriginal people are doing about as well as other Australians. That's the truth, right? So generation after generation, after 1967, Aboriginal people moved into the wider society and they're doing okay. Later, if you like, than the working class, later than migrants who've come to this country, but they've made it, except the last 20%. So the Noel Pearsons, Marcia Langtons, Tom Calmers, all the rest of the world need to answer this question. How come they made it? How come they found a foothold in the modern open society that we live in? And they should reflect on that, and that they should say, what was your journey? You didn't need to change the Constitution. You didn't need treaties. You didn't need a Makarrata Commission. You made it. So how about you tell the last 20% what it takes to get in? And it'll be really humdrum stuff like you got to go to school every day. You got to study hard. You have to save. You know what I mean? We know these lessons. There's nothing new in the world. There is no other world. There is no, spirit where you can live in another world other than your private beliefs. That's okay. But you have to learn how to live in this world and to play your part. And I might say it's not enough to be Aboriginal. You have to do more than that. And that's the truth that the Noel Pearsons, Marcia Langtons, Tom Calmers and all the rest of them refuse to share with the rest of us Australians.
I think the other thing too that gets people going a little bit is this rise of this saying white privilege. I mean, I know it came over from overseas, but it seems to be directed at us a fair bit here too in Australia in general. I gather, yes, a few people who are born into well-to-do families have have certain advantages. But a good 98% of the normal population of Australia, they had to go to school to learn whatever they wanted. They had to get a good job. They had to buy their own house. They had to work to achieve things, to hold a family together. I didn't see any white privilege amongst my peers in my day, and I don't see a lot of it now either, with people struggling to pay mortgages, keep their job, and all those sorts of things. You actually have to commit, have a bit of ambition, and be prepared to do a few hard yards if you actually want to keep your head above the water, sort of thing. And then if you want to get really ahead, well, then you've got to be even more determined and hardworking.
Yeah, the idea of white privilege, of course, is meant to divide us. It's a foul ideology, but it's also meant to excuse people from their own responsibility. That's the cruel bit. And there's no doubt that racism was a cruel thing. It was mainly white on black, but of course, at the moment, where it exists, it could be black on black, brown on brown, yellow on yellow. It's wherever. But there are pockets of it, and it's to be deplored. But that's not the reason why these last 20% of Aboriginal people are failing to integrate. It's got nothing to do with race. It has everything to do with behaviour, because they're finding it difficult to behave in a way that gets them into school, gets them into jobs, gets them into a more settled life. That's partly our fault, but to some extent it's the fault of Aboriginal leaders who've been running the show for the last 30 years, who are not sharing the secrets of the investment you have to make in the person in order to live in this very sophisticated world. So simply to excuse your own failings by saying it's all about white privilege is pathetic, really. It just doesn't cut the mustard. It might in some other societies from time to time, i.e. the US prior to the 1970s or 60s, or in South Africa, 25 years ago. But in Australia, it's a laughable idea.
With Warren Mundine and Jacinta Price, will they be paired as they go around Australia, or will they do separate, have separate itineraries?
It's sort of a mix and a match, Bill. It's sort of sometimes like Jacinta is in Queensland at the moment. She's been running through Brisbane and up into Caloundra, and they'll end up in Townsville, I think, probably today. Warren, gosh, I spoke to him today. I don't know where he was. He's probably in Sydney somewhere. So we circulate, mate. I've been in Perth and I'll be in Adelaide next and down in Tassie. In fact, Warren and I will be together in Tassie, in Hobart, in a couple of weeks. I suppose there is a grand plan. I'm not sure what it is, but the point is at least three of us, there are others, are circulating wherever we're invited.
Yeah.
But to tell you the truth, the bigger plan is to stop a referendum, we need to win in 3 states, because the yes vote has to have a majority of Australians and a majority of states, which is 4 out of 6. We, with our few resources compared to the Yes campaign, need to win 3 states. And frankly, we'll be working hardest in Queensland, Western Australia and South Australia, and probably Tasmania. We'll work on 4 states, and we'll leave New South Wales and Victoria to their own devices. As far as our resources are concerned, I mean, there are millions of other Australians who are having good conversations about this. But from the campaign's point of view, we're going to concentrate on the outer states. And if we win 3, this thing will be defeated.
The other thing that interests me in regards to focusing for the campaign on that, especially the no, is why would people and descendants of people who have come here since the 1950s for a better life from Europe and Asia and wherever, why would they want to buy into this conversation? They came here for equality, that was offered to them as new arrivals, the opportunity to make good for themselves and share in our freedom and democracy. Why would they even think? Has there been any sort of polling or that to find out? Why would they even want to buy into this division?
There's a number of people still don't know a great deal about it, okay? They just hear that there's something going on, that the government wants to have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people recognised in the Constitution. And immigrant groups like the rest of Australia probably nod and say yes, but the moment they understand that it's about a different citizenship, that some people will be held to be more worthy than others, that is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, that's when the migrant community sits back and says, that's not what we signed up to. We thought it was about equal citizenship. At the same time, they'll be very sympathetic and say, well, we understand that there were people here first, and they'll have memories in their own countries of, conflict. We do understand that. So they'll be wanting to help, but worried about the inequality of citizenship that the yes vote would bring. So we can reassure them and say, look, we can recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as a pre-existing people. They were here before us. You acknowledge that in a preamble to the Constitution. It's an historic form of recognition. You cannot have a current form of recognition because whatever words you put in the Constitution, they will get rights. They will be group rights. Even if the High Court doesn't acknowledge that, say in the first year or two, eventually, if you put a group and a bit of architecture called a voice into the Constitution, that applies only to one group, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, they will have group rights that no other Australian will have. So I can reassure migrant communities in Australia that they should vote no, that it will create, the referendum would create a different citizenship, and that's not why they came to this country, but that we can acknowledge the prior occupation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in a preamble, but that's not what the referendum's about. The Prime Minister has got this wrong. He's got the wrong package, and we'll have to defeat it, and then we'll have a discussion next year and ensuing years about an historic form of recognition in a preamble to the Constitution.
Well, Australia's got about 2 million people of Chinese descent in the country. That's a fair number, and they're very well congregated in a number of areas that can quickly be identified. Do you think it's worthwhile to the No campaign to search out a few people within those communities to sort of help get the message across there? Because that's a significant swag of people, 2 million people. So if I was in Victoria, I'd go down to Box Hill, and if I was in New South Wales and Sydney, I suppose there's other sort of areas that you could identify. I don't know Sydney that well, but I know Melbourne.
Yeah.
So you could certainly do a fair bit of recruiting there for the no vote.
Look, Bill, I agree. It's not just the Chinese community, of course, but there'll be any number of identifiable migrant communities who will worry about the purpose of this referendum, as I say, both because they want to be sympathetic to Aboriginal people, but they also worry about the fact that it will introduce inequality. Rest assured, we'll be talking to any group that we can get to in the next 4 months.
If we just go back a little bit, back to the Uluru Statement and the closing the gap, do you think the government got too easily caught up in that, in regards to, yes, we've got to sign up for all these closing the gap requirements, and then we're going to take the Uluru Statement as a serious document and look at the voice, then treaty and truth-telling. I've always found it strange in regards to the Uluru Statement why truth-telling is the last option, or last thing in the series. I would have thought we should start off with truth-telling in the first instance. And I mean, on my grandmother's side, we go back to the First Fleet, basically, with the convicts and that sort of thing. So that side of the family is guilty of all crimes. But the thing is, even that, if you look at the problems that occurred at the time that they occurred, and the periods of what was going in, what law was like, what the hardships were, and set it to that ground and tell the truth, well, it's bearable, if you know what I mean. And all right, we can take a bit of stick, but we can also understand the position that people were in the early 19th century.
Yeah.
The hardships they endured.
Truth-telling is, of course, a misnomer. What that is some Aboriginal people and some university historians want to retell the tales of, if you like, death
Retell or rewrite.
Yeah, death and destruction that occurred with the white settlement of Australia. But they leave out the fact that British common law and then statute law came to this country, which gave protection to Aborigines, which they did not have under their own system. That's conveniently left out. And then, with great respect, all of our history that is known has been written down. We already know the history, and some of it is not good, but it's known. Now, teachers are free to teach it. Why don't they just tell the children? But what Aboriginal leaders really want to say is, we want to tell our version and to oversell the conflict in order to gain reparations. So reparations for what? Something that happened 100 or 200 years ago that should go to some remote descendant today? That's a really stupid way to operate, because that will separate people. So I would pay for something that one of my forebears may have done, 5 generations ago, to a descendant of someone who may have befallen, some evil act 5 generations on. Give it a break. That's a really stupid thing to do. It's no use fighting history. History has been written down. What we need now is the truth telling that says, you are in trouble. Your life is not going well, and how can we help you get out of it? That's the only truth people should be concentrating on.
But reparations, that would also mean, if you're a Chinese person who turned up here only 15 years ago, and there was these repayments from Australian taxpayers, they would be paying it too, technically.
Oh yes, they're a taxpayer.
So
they'd be paying reparations. Bill, it makes no sense. It makes no sense whatsoever. It's a really bad discussion to be having. It's what's happened in New Zealand, really, with their treaty, and we'll move across onto treaty now, that really says, okay, we wrote a treaty of Waitangi in 1840. That should have been the end of the matter, but it isn't. They keep freshening it up. So there's a Maori people, who are a much larger proportion there, about 15-16% of the New Zealand population, who say, we want, via a treaty discussion, to have a slice of whatever New Zealand produces. So they pretend to be, a proud independent people, but in fact, they simply remind us that they're dependent. That's why they're asking for money constantly. They're rent seekers, and that's not a very proud tradition, I might say, and it seems that Aboriginal people want to end up the same. They just want to collect the rent. And I can tell you that that's not a good thing to teach your children, to just sit there and collect the rent for no merit whatsoever. It's a really bad discussion to have. It will separate us. It will, this kills reconciliation, whatever reconciliation means. I think we are reconciled. We're mostly intermarried. How can you get more reconciled than that? But what it will do is begin to divide us and say, I'm not happy with this. Why are we paying for something that happened generations ago? That's a bad conversation.
The other thing that would happen too, I would hope, is all right, if you identify as Indigenous, but your heritage is such that you're maybe only 1/8 Indigenous, do you pay 7/8 of the reparations and only get 1/8 back?
Well, as a mate of mine has said to me many times, that Aboriginality, if you like to use that term, is very porous, right? There are some people in a family who will identify as Aboriginal and some people in a family who will not. That's how remote they are from that blood, if you like. And it could get into all sorts of embarrassing discussions, as you're suggesting. I mean, governments love to cover that sort of stuff over, but it does beg the question, who's in, who's out? I mean, you look at the Tasmanian Aboriginal people, they are all the descendants of the last Aboriginal women who remained and were sort of herded up onto one of the Bass Strait Islands, and white sealers. So they are all both, if you like, the oppressor and the oppressed. So what, you have a treaty with yourself? You pay reparations to yourself? Can we not consider that we have long been reconciled and that we should, in fact, just get on with our lives? That should be a contribution. And whatever private beliefs we have is a matter for us. It's not a matter for public policy.
I think the other thing is the focus, like even with like my kids, is you want them to be global citizens, basically. So you give them a good education, give them opportunities, they get a good job, and they can go anywhere in the world. They can work anywhere in the world. They can, they can integrate and sort of get on with any group of people. My daughter, she's lived in the United States, in Switzerland, and in France for several years at a time, working along with her husband. Now, surely all parents would want to see that for their children in the long run, or grandchildren, that they do get that opportunity and can go anywhere in the world and make a contribution.
Yeah, I think that's a good point you make, Bill, because the whole idea that we acknowledge culture is actually very stultifying. It really says you, Aboriginal person, should sit there and just play that role, when in fact the rest of the world is exploding. And of course, the madness of it is that there might be a child in a remote Aboriginal community. They still have an iPhone, mate. They're in touch with the world. So we can't block out the world. You can see my map behind me. You can't block it out. We should be doing as you've done with your children and I have done with mine. You prepare them for that wider world, whatever it brings. But with Aboriginal kids, we seem to say, no, you stay there, and you hold this truth, this great spirituality, which is a nonsense, of course. We should be open them up to the world in which they live in and we live in. We didn't make it necessarily, it just came upon us. It's grown from millions of brilliant people, actually, that have created this world around us, and it's our obligation to have every Australian child able to cope in that world. And the whole direction of Aboriginal policy seems to me has been to deny to those Aboriginal kids the ability to get into that wider world. We've just stopped that conversation way back in the 70s, and we've cruelled a lot of those kids who really, like yours and mine, should be getting out there and enjoying, of course, but doing the best they can.
I think it's basically this big disadvantage is being shackled to country. Whereas if you look at especially English and that, they went going back, hundreds of years. They went and saw the world. They explored and went well beyond their shores and developed from that. And another thing, I also got Irish heritage, and one thing my grandmother used to tell me, well, Irish were only made for export. Because if you go back to the 18th and 19th century, when there was a lot of poverty and problems in Ireland, they were certainly migrating as fast as they were being born, sort of thing. So we've had that sort of way of life through our history, and this shackling to country, it's regressive, I think.
It is a trap. I mean, I think the best adaptation is where Aboriginal people have gained, for instance, native title, and they acknowledge it and they've got that title, good on them. But then they go and get a job somewhere else, go to where the jobs are. So you get a lot of fly-in, fly-out workers who might be living up the coast of Queensland, but their actual title, their native title area is somewhere inland. That's fine. I mean, that is Australian law. I'm not seeking to undo it. There was, the Koa people out at Winton were granted native title recently, last year. But they live in Brisbane, right? And there's one in Townsville. And I wonder whether their children will really put much store in that native title claim. They might, but I suspect they'll get a phone call in 15 years' time by Ergon or Telstra or whatever to say, oh, we're traversing your native title area, we need to talk to you. And the kids will probably say, what? Who? You know what I mean? Like the whole native title thing, I acknowledge it, it's Australian law, but I wonder what it means to the next generation. And that next generation will scratch their heads and say, I want to know how to learn in this society today. And my message to them is simple. You want a voice? Learn English. That'll get you all the voice you need, and the rest is up to you.
I think that's one of the big problems with the Australian Constitution and most constitutions is they didn't put a national language in it. Like in France, I think the third section in their constitution that is French is the national language. And I think it's a big failing of both the United States Constitution and ours that we didn't put English in as our national language.
Well, it was assumed because we were, 98% English at the Federation.
You can never just assume, put what you intend in writing, thanks. And then we wouldn't have these have to have these agencies with pamphlets there written in about 20 different languages.
Well, that's but just hold up there. The assumption is there's no doubt that we're a single language country. We're not going to go down the path of New Zealand, or rather, Bill, would be very foolish to do so, where things are now written in Maori as well. And one of the reasons for that is because there is no single Aboriginal language. There are a couple of hundred, and most of them, with great respect, are dead or at least sleeping. They are not languages that you can usefully use to talk to anyone else other than a very small group of other people, which is why the default language is and always will be English. And we should be grateful for that because a big slab of the rest of the world also uses English.
If we go back to the Uluru Statement, we got Closing the Gap and we have an annual report, and it's usually the same old sorry story. And we've got the Closing the Gap targets, and some of them are modest and others are a bit going to be a bit difficult to achieve. But that's an ongoing process. Then the last part of the Uluru Statement, you got to the voice. Well, that's happening now. And then after that comes treaty and then truth telling. So we know where we are at the voice. With the government's promised a referendum somewhere between October and somewhere in November, somewhere in that time scale. Maybe we're not sure whether, depending on how it's going, whether they're going to pull it early or late. But the the polls sort of indicating a slump in support. So whether they rush it a bit earlier or delay it a bit more, I'm not sure. But we've got that on the books. Treaty. All right. My understanding is a treaty is something between two sovereign powers. It's identified. I can't see how we can ever have a treaty with our own citizens. Now, you're talking about when Britain first came here, the Indigenous were looked after under common law. They were also afforded, although they probably didn't know it, they were British subjects, just like every other person in Australia at that time, British subject. The only problem they probably had is they didn't have good legal representation to push that point.
Yeah. Look, the notion of a treaty between ourselves is a nonsense, but governments will use it to, if you like, work their way out of a difficult situation. That is, a group of Australians of Aboriginal descent who demand something, and they'll call it a treaty, and they'll get the taxpayer to pay them some money. So I wouldn't give any credence to the idea of an actual treaty. There is only one sovereign, the Crown in Australia. The High Court has said that many times. There is no sovereignty in Aboriginal groups. As much as they want to proclaim it, they can proclaim it uphill and down dale. It'll make no difference, except that it'll screw money out of the Commonwealth taxpayer. And the states are doing their own. They have even less credibility when it comes to talking about treaties, but they will spend money on it. So we can dispense with the idea of a treaty at a sort of conceptual level, but it will be used as a device to extract money from the taxpayer. That's all it's about, Bill. And we should fight it. We should deny it. We should say that how can you have a deal, a treaty between a husband and wife, where one's Aboriginal and one's non-Aboriginal? Why would you have a treaty with your neighbour, with a friend, with a workmate? This will drive us apart. That's the evil in this whole idea of treaty.
Well, we've got the South Australian and Victorian governments already well underway with this sort of rubbish. And I find the problem is they need to find another word for other than treaty to describe what they're doing, because it's not a treaty. And then you've got Anastasia up here. They came to Cairns earlier in May and had a parliament sat at their conference centre. And one of the things there was the introduction of the pathway to treaty. And they've allocated $346 million to just the process. The process, mind you, not doing anything, but that's going to be obviously a lot of money to be eaten up by various groups and public servants over a period of 4 years.
Yeah, you must understand that the biggest element of the Aboriginal industry is just getting paid to have meetings. It suits public servants. They all look busy. They're all talking to each other. They all get paid to sit, and they all feel important. So that's the culture that's developed in the last 30, 40 years, that public servants talk to Aboriginal leaders and they get paid to sit and meet. They don't do anything. They don't solve any problems. They just keep talking about problems. So it's quite an expensive thing, but that actually suits both sides. The only people that are left out are you and me. We pay for it. And not enough people, not enough taxpayers are sufficiently interested or knowledgeable about this area. So frankly, we let them get away with it. Any government that suggests this sort of treaty process should be thrown out. But unfortunately, too many Aussies are just asleep. We let it go by because we've all got more important things to do. But gee, if you can get this one thing into your head, it's actually harming children. It's not just a bit of loose change. We can forgive that almost, but it does harm children in the long run.
Well, the other thing is too, we look at all the groups in that pathway as well. Up here, we've got what you call resi homes and that. and NGOs look after them and get paid handsomely for juvenile offenders to provide them a safe haven of a nighttime sort of thing. The judges put them into these resi cares, but they have no control over them. So it's not money well spent. And you still have to wonder about all these thousands of organisations, how much of that taxpayer money is being absorbed over time.
Well, look, they're not sufficient evaluations of Aboriginal programs. We know this. The Commonwealth Productivity Commission, which I used to sit on, has been given the task of evaluating Aboriginal programs. The trouble is they're highly compromised, because they say that part of the process is that you have to acknowledge Aboriginal self-determination, which is the equivalent of saying we should look at how Australian consumers can have the cheapest cars as long as they're Australian made and union run. You know, that's how stupid it's got, right? So the Productivity Commission's been nobbled in this regard. There are not too many people you can really rely on anymore, Bill, in this area. But I can tell you that all the claims that Aboriginal leaders made about Aboriginal controlled organisations being better than non-Aboriginal controlled are just wrong. They are absolutely wrong. It's just an assertion.
Okay, we've done our hour, and you've probably got more important things to do. I wish you all the best in this venture. I know it's got to be a hard slog, but someone's got to do it.
We'll do it, Bill. We'll do it. And please, if people can come to our website, Recognise a Better Way, just Google that. And if they want more depth, there are a lot of good papers there on that website.
The other thing is, will you, Australians for Unity, will that have a website as well?
No, Bill, that really sits, it's sort of like a management group. That'll sit in the background. It just helps both Fair Australia and Recognise a Better Way to work together. But my substantive work will be Recognise a Better Way.
Yep. Okay then. And if you just hold there for a second, I'll just introduce next week's episode, and we'll close off. If you have enjoyed the show tonight, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Next week, I'll have Natalie Raymond on. She's the organiser of YIMBY, which is, yes, in my backyard, who wants development and instead of this NIMBY stuff of not in your backyard. So that would be an interesting conversation, especially with the housing situation we've got at the moment in Australia. So please join me next week. Thank you.